Hi, my name is Deb Tucker from Studio 180 Design, and I'm going to talk to you today about one of my technique sheets called Picket Fences. Picket Fences is a name that I made up for when I create a unit that looks like this. I use this unit quite a bit because I like to make these leaves like the ones you see behind me. And these particular units are what you see in the leaf here and in the leaf here. Usually, if you see this type of unit in some type of pattern or magazine, there's always a presumption that's associated with this technique. And that presumption is, of course, that you are going to be a perfect quilter. You're going to be a perfect cutter, you're going to be a perfect stitcher, you're going to be a perfect presser. And then at the end, these little units are going to be perfectly sized and perfectly shaped. Well, in the real world, it doesn't always happen like that. I know because I've been a teacher for almost 30 years. So what I do when I make my picket fences, instead of starting with my squares and rectangles, exactly the size that I want them to finish to, I start with my squares and rectangles a little bit bigger than they need to be. I bump up the width of my rectangle 1/4 of an inch. I bump up my length 1/4 of an inch, and I bump up the size of my square also 1/4 of an inch bigger. When I do that, I'm going to make these picket fences using a traditional folded corner method. This is just one of the techniques, but I'm going to talk about this one first. I take those squares, put them right sides together with the rectangles. I draw a line, and in this case, because I need the mirror images, one line goes in one direction, one diagonal goes in the other. Stitch on the lines that I've drawn, and then proceed to press those triangles back into the corner. Now that was the thing that always tended to cause the issue, because sometimes they would press back and be perfectly aligned, and other times they wouldn't quite line up in the corner as nicely as I liked. But I don't have to worry about that with mine because they're bigger than they need to be. What I'm going to do now is take this unit, use one of my favorite tools, my wing clipper tool that I use for flying geese, and this is 2/3 of a flying goose unit, and I'm going to actually trim this down. So once I put on my glasses so I can see, I'm going to line up the diagonal guideline that goes into the corner of my unit. I'm going to check to make sure that I can make this be the size that it needs to be, in this case 2 inch by 3.5. And I'm going to be able to clean up one corner, get it perfectly square, have the seam exactly where I want it, going right into the corner, take the unit, rotate it around, and do my traditional trim just like I do for all my other flying geese units. Line up my 2, line up my 3.5, and make my rectangle be exactly the right size and have all the seams going exactly where I want them. Now this unit is pretty easy. That diagonal seam goes into the upper right hand corner when it's right side up. But when I look at this unit, it doesn't do that. That diagonal seam is going into the upper left. I need it to go into the upper right to be able to trim. So what I'm going to do is simply take the unit and flip it over. Now I've got a seam line that's indicating into the upper right. Again, line up the diagonal, trim up the side, across the top, turn it around, and trim just the same way. Now remember, the wing clipper is usable for both right and left-handers. Right-handers, you're putting things horizontal to do your trimming. If you happen to be left-handed, you're simply going to rotate that unit so that it's vertical. You're going to line up that diagonal guideline going into that upper left-hand corner. Let me see if I can do this. But a left-hander, you would actually then trim up the left and across the top. I'm not going to take the blade off because I'm not very good at cutting with my left hand. So this is one way to make the picket fences. Once you're done and you've trimmed them down, you'll have that excess fabric underneath. I would go back, take a pair of scissors, and actually trim that down to 1/4 of an inch seam. Now I like that technique and it works pretty well, but there's another technique that I've been playing with to make those same picket fence units, and I'd like to explain it to you. It's also explained on our technique sheet. Since the unit, the picket fence, is 2/3 of a flying goose, I came back to my favorite method of making flying goose, where I use big squares and small squares. To make this version of the picket fence, instead of cutting 2 rectangles and 2 squares, which is 4 pieces, I'm only going to cut 2 squares. The sizes for the squares are listed on the technique sheet. I'm going to take the squares, the small and the large, position the small square into the corner of the large, but not all the way in the corner. Just like when I make my flying geese, it's going to be offset by about 2 or 3 threads. Once I've positioned that in the corner, I'm going to use a marker and mark 2 sewing lines that are 1/4 of an inch on either side. I like to use my magic wand to make that happen. Once I've marked the lines, I'm going to stitch on the lines. Now I'm not stitching all the way to the end of the square, just stitch on the lines on the small square. Once they're stitched, I'm going to put my cutter and actually trim in between so that now I have these units, and you're thinking, wait, I don't quite see it yet, but I'm going to take those and press them. And once I do, they started like this. Let me see if I can get you there. They started like this, and I press them out. Now what you can see, when I trim away this, and when I trim away this, I'm going to have my picket fence units. This one, the diagonal goes into the upper right. That's what I'm focusing on because I'm right-handed. Let me show you how it works. I'm going to put that there. Simply line up the diagonal guideline here. I'm making sure that I've got enough fabric to be able to cut my 2 by 3.5, which is the size of the picket fence unit that I'm using. Clean up the corner, rotate the unit around, line up that 2-inch by 3.5. This X should be on that seam line pretty much. Trim up, trim across. There again, I have a perfect picket fence unit. Since the diagonal doesn't go into the upper right, flip it over so that the diagonal for me as a right-hander goes into the upper right, and trim again using that same process of lining up the diagonal, checking to make sure my 2 and my 3.5-inch increments are completely encased, and I'm going to be able to trim the other 2 sides. So if you think you'd like to try this technique, check out our website, check out your local quilt shop, pick up one of our technique sheets on picket fence, head to your sewing room, head to your fabric, and give it a try.